Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. You can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be talking about social media and racism. And there's a long tradition in the social sciences of trying to measure and study racism. So you can think of political science. How much do people's racial attitudes affect their political behavior? Or in computer science, people try to build classifiers and algorithms that can automatically detect racism in social media posts. But what does social media signify or mean for racism more broadly? I think that's the more interesting question and what we will be discussing in this episode. And my guest today is Dr. Rob Eschmann. He is an associate professor of social work at Columbia University and has recently published a book entitled When the Hood Comes Off: Racism and Resistance in the Digital Age, published by University of California Press. And in the book, Dr. Eschmann presents the results of a number of case studies that examine racism from different perspectives. So, for example, on the one hand, looking at how college students at elite American universities experience racism through social media in a more qualitative way through interviews, but then also looking at how social media can be sites of resistance for communities of color and how they share experiences of racism through a more quantitative analysis of Twitter data. But I think more than the results of any one particular study, it is really interesting and valuable to think about, what does social media mean when it comes to racism? What does it signify or tell us about race and racism in modern day societies? And also, what does it do, or what can it do to help make societies more inclusive and equitable? And one of Dr. Eschmann's core arguments, and you'll hear more about it from him in just a moment, is that historically in the United States, racism has been very open and unmasked in terms of having segregation policies where it was legal to be racist and say racist things. But as social norms, and maybe to a lesser extent policies, have shifted more towards making racism either illegal or unacceptable in society, that has pushed racism back under the hood, in Dr. Eschmann's terms. But social media provides a space for racism to be unmasked and visible. And so in this episode, we'll be talking all about, what does that mean? What does that signify? What do we do about it? So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Rob Eschmann. Again, he is an associate professor of social work at Columbia University. Dr. Eschmann, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Of course, I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start out with one of the book's core arguments, namely around masked racism. You argue that much of today's racism in the United States is subtle and masked, but social media has worked to unmask racism in ways beneficial for society. So could you recap this argument for us? What does it mean to say that racism is masked, and how has social media contributed to this unmasking?
Yeah, that is a great question to start with. So when I'm talking about masked racism, I think if we go back to the Jim Crow era, right? So the years before the victories of the classic civil rights movement, racism was open, it was overt, it was the law of the land, it was legal to be racist. So there was no reason that anyone had to hide their racism. People were racist and proud, right? They were open about it. But after the civil rights movement, or the victories of the classic years of the civil rights movement, racism kind of went out of style. That racism is now illegal, right? It's illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. Racism is seen as being morally evil. Even people who support racist policies and practices do not want to be labeled a racist, right? The folks who are racist and proud now are kind of limited to the white supremacist groups. And so if we look at some data, things like if you ask people, hey, do you think schools should be integrated or segregated? Nowadays, most people are going to say integrated, whereas in 1940s, most people would say they should be segregated. If you look at the data on, do you believe interracial marriage should be legal? In the 1930s, most people said no, it should not be legal. And now almost everyone, over 90% of people say, yes, it should be legal. So these look like big changes in racial attitudes, but what's really happening is that racism is just becoming more subtle. So when I talk about masked racism, I'm talking about racism that's hidden. People who know not to pick the racist answer when they're filling out a survey, people who know not to say the racist thing at work or in school, or even people who don't have any conscious racist ideas, but whose behaviors or policies they support continue racial inequality. And I think that that's something that we get from leading theories of sociology are the ways that racism continues to be powerful despite the reduction in overt hate of people of different racial groups. So how is it that racism is embedded in the way that we do things in our society, in our interactions, without anyone deciding, hey, you know what, I dislike people from this group. And so there's lots of ways that we can uncover mass racism, but everyone doesn't have the skills or the experience that would allow them to do that. So when I'm talking about mass racism, I'm talking about the racism that is hidden from people who have not experienced racism or who have not studied it or who have not engaged in fighting against it. And when we're talking about unmasking racism, we're revealing where racism lives. And so an example of that, right, that I think is in the media a lot now is critical race theory, which is just a framework for trying to show how racism is a core part of our laws and our policies and the way that the world works. This is unmasking racism in a way that is powerful and that folks in power want to stop, to keep it masked so that we can believe the myth that we're past the race problem. We elected a black president, which means how could we be in a country that still harbors racism?
Right. And I mean, you have these big society-wide examples like critical race theory, but also in the book, you focus on a lot of cases from college campuses, which I thought is really interesting, where you argue that there are these rules of racial engagement that you can kind of study by focusing on college campuses. And it kind of took me back to my undergraduate days where I recognized some of these situations that college students reported to you in your research, but also that you reported as your experiences as a college student. So I'm curious to hear a bit about your choice to focus on college campuses as sites to study masked racism. And if you could elaborate a bit on this case of a Facebook page called Politically Incorrect Confessions, which I thought was an interesting site to look at when racism is sort of masked and unmasked.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that college students are at a unique point in life where they are, they have the values that they learn from home, and then they come to school and they are exposed to new ideas, and they're really figuring themselves out and what they believe and who they are as people. Also, America's pretty segregated. So for a lot of folks, that college ends up being the first time that they may be able to develop meaningful relationships with people of different racial groups. So it really is a unique space to talk with people about race. And then when we're thinking about race and technology, or race on the internet in particular, the piece about colleges that excites me the most from a methods perspective, right, is that there's less of a disconnect between your online life and your face-to-face life when you're on a college campus. Your Facebook friends, you follow people on Instagram who go to school with you, and right, like, people may have hundreds of acquaintances that they're connected with on social media without really knowing everyone in real life. And it just means that when you post something over the weekend, that the next week people in your class have seen it, that there really is this connection between your online community and your face-to-face community. And right, that's not always the case. Sometimes we can, be tricked into believing that our online worlds are completely distinct or separate from our face-to-face realities. And so I think that colleges are a unique place for studying online behavior for that reason. Now, the website you mentioned, Politically Incorrect Confessions, this popped up. This is actually right how I began the study. Was this website popped up that allowed students to engage in anonymous discussions around controversial topics. So the website was created in a way that you had to be a student in order to post, but that your name was not attached to what you post. And this is almost universally remembered by students as just being a home for horribly racist content in a really disturbing way. And I think that one of the unique things about this, which goes back to your question about why I study students in college, is that lots of people are exposed to racism online. But when it's anonymous and you don't know where it's coming from, it's easy to think about, oh, that's not from people in my circle or my community. This is from a racist, right? Or you may have the stereotype of who is a racist. Oh, this must be from someone in Texas. That this is not someone from my backyard. This is not someone who lives near me or who goes to my school. And what was unique about this page is that no, these were all college students from the same university making these statements, which let students of color know that the people making these ugly comments are the people who they are sharing the dining hall with, who they are living with in the dorms, who they're studying with in the library. And that made it hit a little bit more close to home, really made them rethink some of their ideas about race and racism. And so, that was the page that really got the study started. And if I could just share one example from the site, I think there are many ugly, horrid examples of overt in your face racism and racist jokes. But one of the messages that stood out to me was a message where someone wrote, "Why are there so many Black people in the cafeteria? If I wanted to hear this kind of vernacular, I would go over to a Black neighborhood nearby campus." And just the idea, I just thought about myself as a college student and how I needed, in order to focus, I had to get away from the dorms and all the video games that were being played, and I had to get to the library to do my work. And I just imagine, what would college me have done if I had received an anonymous message telling me that Black students were unwanted in the library, right? That may have made me feel unsafe, more stressed and anxious to be in that space. And so just an example of how this anonymous comment could really have a negative impact on Black students and other students of color. So that's really what drove me to begin this study.
Yeah, really interesting point on this integration between social media and college life. I hadn't thought about it exactly in those terms, that they really are integrated. And then the things that you're seeing becomes points for discussion the next week. And then if you have a Facebook page where people are posting racist or discriminatory things, it hits you differently, right? Because it's like, that's someone anonymous in my literal block or 2 block radius. But you argue that the visibility of these racist discourses online is actually sort of a net positive, because it shows that it exists and that it does occur in people who are not so as far removed as we might think. So what is the logic there behind this idea that being exposed to racism online may actually have benefits for how we think about and discuss race?
Yeah, yeah. I want to be careful with my language there. I wouldn't want to say it has a net positive benefit. I think that experiences with those types of things can be harmful for health and mental health for folks of color. I wouldn't say that they are wanted, but I do think that they have an effect on the way that people think about race. I talk with students who really believe that race was a problem of the past, who did not believe that racism was a problem on campus. But after this webpage, they began to understand where racism lived. They began to, right, they were surprised, but then it really changed how they thought about race and racism in a way that is a little bit more advanced and more honest about how the world works, right? And I have other students who had a hard time convincing their friends that racism was real and that racism still existed until this page popped up, and then they were able to point to it as proof. And I think that is what happens when racism is unmasked, that it is something that forces people and communities to come to terms with the ugly and hidden realities of our society, that these racist ideas do exist. And you just kind of follow the logic train. If there are hidden racists, then that means that sometimes when, a Black person's going up for a job, maybe they're not given an equal look as everybody else, right? And so I think that that's something that we can have happen when we have data about what racism looks like, whether it's racism online or whether it's racism in employment records, racism in health disparities, that it can unmask racism. It can prove to people, hey, let's look at the data. Let's think about this logically. We can show you where racism lives. And once we know it's there, then it can be easier to recruit people to be on the side of, let's try to get rid of this monster that we thought was asleep.
Right. And point taken on being careful to phrase racist discourse as a net positive or benefit. But I think you are pointing to the fact that there are some perhaps more nuanced perspectives in thinking about the visibility of race online. And that brings up the question of content moderation, because on the one hand, if exposure to racist discourses online can have this sort of awareness generation, or being able to point to that and say, look, it does exist, there is some value to having it there as an artifact of some kind. But then platforms are sort of moving aggressively to remove this content as fast as possible. So, how do you see that kind of dynamic between, on the one hand, having sites or fora where racism can be unmasked and exposed, and then on the other side, platforms that are really trying to just remove and delete this content as if it doesn't exist?
That's a great point. I don't know that there are any platforms that are doing that great of a job where you can't find any more racism in that space. I think that you have some automatic moderation of racial slurs, right? People can get around that. You just spell a word, right? Something that we see a lot with online discourses. If there's a word that gets moderated, then people spell it differently. My kids play video games, and I do my best to, right? Like, and I'm someone who I'm a tech guy. I know what's waiting for them in the online games, and I know how to cut off the chat function and this and that, and make it so they can only talk to their friends and try to reduce the extent to which they might be exposed to racism. But they tell me about, oh, they met someone whose username was the N word but spelled with numbers, so that it got past the moderators. And so things like that is like, right, like, or people, using the chat function, and they may not be able to say the N word, but they spell monkey in a strange way, right? Like, so there are ways of people getting around content moderation to still get the racist content out there. So I think that that's one, is that we haven't figured out how to be perfect with content moderation. And then two, I think that tech does not necessarily want to moderate from a educational and anti-racist perspective. That is not what big tech wants to do. You look at Elon Musk with Twitter, and his purported reason for buying Twitter was because he felt like there was too much censoring going on, and he wanted there to be less moderation. And I think that there are folks who live in this world who would say that Elon Musk buying Twitter was intentional because Twitter had been too good of a platform for helping folks of color organize in activist efforts fighting against racism in different ways. And then I think you look at some place like Facebook and Instagram and now Threads, and they are explicitly apolitical. And some of the moderation that goes on those pages that we hear about is moderation that is stopping activists from talking about, anti-oppressive things. And so I think the tech companies have become the moderators, and they're not necessarily the moderators that we want. And so that is a little bit worrisome. And that is an area of this work that is still cloudy and that we're trying to understand, but I don't think we have a perfect understanding just yet.
No, it's definitely a tough question, but I was curious to get your thoughts, and I think it segues nicely into another data source for the book, which is Twitter. And you've done a lot of research on Twitter in the context of microaggressions, which are also things that are very difficult to capture with an automated content moderation filter. But before we get into your research on Twitter and microaggressions, you spend a good portion of the book talking about Black Twitter and its significance for people of color. And I know that's kind of a thing from having done some research on Twitter myself and just seeing that it is a very vibrant community there. So can you tell us a little bit about Black Twitter and its role for people of color?
Yeah, yeah. I think Black folks are overrepresented on Twitter. And Black Twitter is a phenomenon of, Black folks getting together and engaging in discussions, not just of justice issues, but just, I think one of my favorite things that's come out of Black Twitter was, as Game of Thrones was, in its heyday, people were live tweeting Game of Thrones. And I think in the age of streaming, I rarely ever watch a TV show right when it comes out. Like, I watch it when it's convenient for me, right? And as a huge Game of Thrones fan, I've read all the books. I had to start watching it right when it came out, because otherwise I get notifications on my phone with spoilers because Black Twitter was live tweeting it, right? So I think that the hashtag was Thrones, y'all. And I began to watch the show, live with all the other Black folks who were on Black Twitter who were, talking about what was going on in real time. And so I think that was a lot of fun. But Black Twitter is a space where, right, people can come together to celebrate, to mourn, to, right, talk about justice and activist issues. And I think it is something that is both a part of building the movement for Black lives, and then also as a product of the movement for Black lives, and how that movement has made Twitter the space for us to get together and have important conversations. In the book, I am intentional about not spending as much time with the big ticket items, with the things that everyone has heard of, the big hashtags, and exploring kind of the ways that organizing and Black Twitter have made the news, and instead thinking about resistance and experiences with racism among everyday folks. And so, when I step onto Twitter, it's not to look at the things that are the most tweeted, but it's to look at how everyday people are engaging in conversations on Twitter and how that might be changing the way that we think about different forms of racism and different ways of responding and reacting to racism. So, definitely was a lot of fun to jump into Twitter. And I don't want to get ahead of myself. I think you're going to ask me about microaggressions, but chapter 6 of the book, I talk about this new concept I developed called double-sided consciousness, which is a riff off of Du Bois's double consciousness theory. And to do that, I go to Black Twitter and I look at a word that they made up, Y people, WYPIPO. And it is a creative spelling that sounds like white people when you say it out loud. Going back to moderation, that one of the trends that you see on Twitter is that, there are Black folks who get banned for talking about white people. Not because they're talking about white people in a hateful or negative way, but because they are challenging racism and referencing white folks when they do that. And then that can lead the content moderators to give them temporary or permanent suspensions or bans. And so they came up with a creative spelling for the word white people in order to engage in conversations about whiteness. And that's something that I explore in that chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book, partly because of the data and partly because it's the chapter where I really allow myself to interact with some of my favorite rappers and rap lyrics as I put these ideas and theories together. So, yeah, absolutely. Black Twitter is a big part of the book and a big part of the net positive that I see from, thinking about racism and resistance online, is that Black folks on Twitter are really leading the way in pushing the world to think about race and racism in different ways.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I mean, when you're thinking about resistance to racism, I mean, there are the kind of large scale movements and connective action, and there's that kind of resistance that we've seen in the past couple of years at very large scale. But this concept of microaggression, I think, is much more subtle, much more nuanced, and much more difficult to study, I think. And one of the questions I have for you about it first is what is microaggressions? Because I have a follow-up question that I'm curious about.
Yeah, so microaggressions are subtle racial slights. So they're ways of speaking or acting that are not overt enough, not racist enough for you to report them to HR or for you to call someone out for being a racist, but they are uncomfortable, and they're the types of things that people of color experience, very often over time, and they may question, our appearance, our speech. So some examples of microaggressions, things that happen on campuses all the time, right? So as a, Black person on campus, I got carded in weird places and at weird times where I shouldn't have. And so the idea that a Black person on campus should not be there and needs to show ID, this is a kind of a textbook microaggression. Or folks of Latinx or Asian backgrounds being told that they speak English so well. Right, that there's this assumption that if you're Asian, if you're Latinx, that means that you are a recent immigrant, and it is surprising that your English is so good. That is a microaggression, right? When you can have Asian and Latinx folks who are third, fourth generation Americans, but still being treated like a perpetual foreigner, right? So these are examples of microaggressions that folks of color experience all the time. We know that microaggressions have a negative impact on health and mental health. And we also know, right, the literature talks about the most common way to respond to microaggressions is to not respond. Right. I talk about studying microaggressions on Twitter, but I also studied microaggressions, in the interviews where I found that students talked about being much more likely to see or to participate in challenging microaggressions on social media than they did when they were in face-to-face settings, that it just felt more safe and that they had more community, support, that the norms, they were really able to change the norms and make it so that microaggressions were something that were not ignored online in the same way that they had been in person.
Yeah, and I mean, the data and also your personal anecdotes in the book are very convincing about microaggressions, and also the examples you just gave here. What I genuinely openly wonder is there a risk that microaggressions become too relative, in the sense that can anyone sort of claim a microaggression, or does it have to be a sort of pattern of experiences?
That is a great question. And because I think something that we hear a lot is this idea of, oh, you're pulling the race card. Oh, why do we have to make this about race? And the reality is most folks of color do not choose race and racism as the first explanation. It is so difficult for us to convince people that something is about racism. We do not try and make that claim lightly, right? I can think about times where, I'm having conversations with white friends. I remember once someone talked about something that happened, and I said, "Oh yeah, but you're white. I don't know that I could get away with that." And another friend there said, "What? Oh, come on, man. Why do we have to take it there? Why do we have to go about race?" And it makes me laugh to think about it, right? This really over the top response to bringing up racial differences and how people are treated in different contexts, and that being almost offensive to a white person for that to be brought up. And I think that that is why one of the reasons people don't respond to microaggressions is they're unsure that it was a microaggression. That we ask ourselves, are they following me around the store because they think I'm going to steal because I'm black, or because they just want to be ready to help me as soon as I need help? Or maybe they just needed to fold clothes in this area, right? And it's kind of over time, you're able to be confident, all right, this is predictable and they're not following other people. Yes, this is about race. Or an example I give in the book is a friend of mine who would get carded every time he went into the law school library on campus where we were graduate students. And it took him multiple trips before he called out the security guard and said, "Why do you card me and no one else? Because you don't need to show an ID to get in this library, but you keep asking me every time I come. At this point, like, it's been 5 or 6 times, and I see that this is not a normal thing. Why are you doing that?" And that was the last time that they got carded going in. But it took them 5 or 6 times to have the confidence to say, "You know what, I think that this is about race, and now I feel like I'm going to call it out." And so I think part of the answer is yes, over time, when we learn about other people's stories, when we look at patterns in our own lives, we can gain confidence to call things microaggressions. But I don't think you should have to wait that long of a time. That's part of the problem, is that we are made to doubt our own experiences. And we put an emphasis on understanding whether there was a reason that is not related to race that would be a better explanation for that behavior.
Right. And I think the example you gave of sort of going around in the store and thinking of multiple scenarios of what is the explanation for this behavior, it can kind of lead you down a rabbit hole or a dark space. And you've actually done some research. We've talked a little bit about, doing interviews, but you've also done large scale surveys looking at the effect of these microaggressions on mental health. So can you tell us a little bit about your online racial discussion survey and what you found regarding microaggressions, mental health, and resisting racism?
Yeah, it's a survey that was piloted with college students from around the country, and then we ran it with a nationally representative sample of folks from around the country. And the survey really wanted to look at experiences with race, not just online, but also in person. I wanted to look at how much people are talking about race when they're in their everyday lives and face-to-face settings versus online. And then wanted to look at the effects to see, are the effects of online racism similar to the effects of face-to-face racism? And we found that, yes, that we adapted a microaggression scale that came from in-person microaggression scale, and found very similar results, that experiencing racism online has similar effects on anxiety and depression and stress as those experiences with racism. So we know that it is harmful. It takes energy. It is depleting. And it has a negative impact on folks' mental health when they experience racial microaggressions online, just like it does when they experience racial microaggressions in person.
And how do you think that these dynamics, I mean, we've talked a little bit about content moderation, as you were saying, sort of live tweeting during Game of Thrones. I'm curious to get your thoughts on how we're seeing a general shift towards more visual content across different platforms. And on the one hand, that makes it much more difficult to moderate automatically, but also it might have, even more powerful impacts because you can put a lot of, really nasty stuff encoded into a picture. But perhaps it also works to empower in certain ways more because of the power of visuals. So I'm just curious to get your thoughts on, as we're moving towards short form video with TikTok and Reels, how do you see this visual type of content working into your ideas about microaggressions, about Black communities on social media? Where do you think all that is sort of heading?
That is a great question. I think that it's a mixed bag. One of the things that we've seen happen with TikTok is that Black TikTokers are not given credit and do not experience the same reward for coming up with cool dances or funny trends as do white content creators. That there's a lot of examples of Black folks coming up with a dance, and then you have the white person who copies the dance, who's the one that gets rich and famous off that dance. And so I think that, the visual algorithm is easier. Let me not say it's easier for it to be racist, but I think that we are seeing examples of racism being inherent in the visual algorithms, and there being kind of a problem with Black creators not getting the face time that they deserve given their creativity and talent. I also think that videos can be more engaging. And so, there are lots of examples of people using videos to explain justice issues. Videos can be useful for showing proof. There's examples with things that are happening in Israel and Palestine right now that people have been sharing videos from Palestine on the ground. And that's a little bit different in terms of us hearing narratives about the war and the conflict, and then seeing things on the ground. It changes the dynamic a little bit, especially when there's certain types of footage that are not allowed to be on mainstream media, or that people choose not to share in mainstream media that you can see in social media. So I think that visual component can add to some activist efforts, but then also, right, like there's something to be said for reading, and a lot of the folks who were leaders on Black Twitter were Black bloggers too. And so there was a market for messages in long form that people were reading and learning and really engaging in a lot of intellectual development of their racial and political consciousness. And I think that is something that maybe there's a little, like, if you don't have links from this TikTok to a blog where the idea is built out in the same way that Twitter users were back in the day, that then there's a little bit less chance for that kind of more hearty consciousness development. And so, I think that there are pros and there are cons. I think that the way that we evaluate these things is never just about the medium. It's about what the messages are and how useful that they are to activist communities.
Yeah, interesting point. I think maybe there's a paper on algorithmic microaggressions somewhere in the future, but I think that exact trade-off between kind of the exposure through short form content, but also maybe hiding access to, or not enabling access to, longer form content is a problem, both for racism, but also for things like political information, political knowledge, those deep thoughts that are really positive for a good democratic citizenry. But I want to end with a huge question here, and it's about the role of race in America, which is such a dominant topic and so salient. And I think, as you're alluding to, there are benefits to really getting into deep reflective thoughts about race in America and how to deal with it. And I'm just curious, because being over in Europe, race is just not as salient, or it's discussed in different ways, like migration or assimilation, even though there are also histories of racism and colonialism. So I guess my question is, what are your thoughts on racism's saliency in America? Is this a good thing? And, especially as we're heading into an election year where race will be featured prominently. I mean, what are your thoughts on how to approach this topic in a respectful, responsible way? And maybe also, if there's a digital component that can be worked in, how can we use platforms in a way to have constructive dialogues about race in America? There's a lot of questions and a lot of huge questions. So however you'd like to answer it.
Yeah. You may have to remind me of some of the sub questions as I begin to answer. But yeah, so I think there are lots of important points there. This is a difficult moment because I think people are being primed to not want to engage in conversations about race. And I think silence around issues of race has been the norm for a long time. So that's not necessarily new. But if you look at this attack on critical race theory, people don't want to hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That people see that this is a politically charged topic. So if you begin the conversation, some people are starting now with the idea that this is not something that should ever need to be talked about. So what are we like? All right, if my political stance is to not discuss this, how then will I engage you in a conversation? I think that is a huge difficulty for us right now. I think that the more we talk about race and racism, the more we're going to be able to get people to see our perspective. I really believe that silence is racism's strongest ally, that by just not talking about it, by pretending it's not there, then that means the status quo is going to reproduce itself. And right now, the status quo in America is racist, right? That our education system, our funding is racist and unequal, that our housing policies are racist. I think we look at mass incarceration. Racism is the reason why we have so much growth and how many people we're trying to put behind bars. And we can clearly demonstrate these things historically And if we can open up dialogue to have a conversation about them, we're going to expose the ways that racism is working in these systems that are very mainstream and are assumed to be race neutral. If we don't talk about race in those contexts, then how will we ever prove to people where racism lives? And so I think that, just engaging in the conversation can be important, and that people should know that it can be effective. So one of the studies I don't it's not a huge part of the book, but I reference a study as a paper that I did with some colleagues of mine where we looked at tweets about Colin Kaepernick and people who hated Kaepernick. And we wanted to see who changes their mind and what predicts people changing their mind about Kaepernick in 1 week's time. And when I say change their mind, I'm referring to the first time he went viral for kneeling, and millions of people were tweeting anti-Kaepernick tweets and burning his jersey and burning their Nike jerseys for having a commercial in support of him. And then, right, we looked at people who changed their mind in just a week's time, and the more messages people received, the more likely they were to make a concession. And that really just engaging in the conversation can be effective and can get people to see things from a different point of view. And I know that's not the way that we typically think about online arguments or discussions. And so, yeah, those are my initial two thoughts. Are there pieces of that question I'm missing here?
I guess one is just about the digital component. I mean, it's difficult to think what is feasible in terms of what platforms might be willing or technically able to do. But I mean, would one positive benefit, to come back to that term, be to encourage more interactions between users of different races or ethnicities? This idea of contact theory, might that be something that is a positive development that digital tools could enable? Because I think, as you mentioned with TikTok, there are some algorithmic considerations that may also be perpetuating forms of racism as well. So is there a role for digital platforms in creating engaging and constructive dialogue around race?
That's a great question. I do think that there's a role for digital platforms to do that, because I think that one of the things I found in my interviews is that over and over again, when I talk to students about their own racial consciousness development, they pointed to social media or blogs as being the places where they learned what racism was. And, in that, right, when they're going to schools that do not teach them about racism, they learned it from activists and thinkers online who are doing this work for free. I love that. It excites me that that happened. It also worries me as an educator, given how much misinformation is online. And it makes me wonder, is there a way we can institutionalize the brilliance of Black Twitter and Black activists and activists of color who are creating these kind of informal educational opportunities for young people online? And maybe there is, but the reality is not all institutions are trustworthy when it comes to that type of thing. Not everyone thinks the same or is as comfortable promoting radical, ideas that are deemed radical because they're so far from the status quo. And so I think that is a difficulty. And this is getting to your question, is what can we do digitally? I think people are already doing things digitally, that there are already ways for you to learn about what prison abolition is on social media. There are ways to think about reparations, or what does it mean to defund the police and why is that needed. These things are happening. We also have people in their silos where they don't always see those messages, or people who are being tricked into thinking that any kind of conversation about race is an attack on American values, as opposed to, challenging America to live up to its values. And so there is a difficulty in keeping these conversations going and really reaching across the political aisle to try and build coalitions between different groups that would allow us to really define what the problem is, who the enemy is, right, in a context where the middle class is under attack, and the people that want to maintain racial inequality are also the people who want to shrink the middle class. And so I think that this is something there's opportunity for movement building and growth there. But and I definitely think digital tools can be central to helping people be able to cross that political aisle and come to a greater political understanding of their own consciousness and the type of world they want to live in, and ways that they believe we can create a different world.
Definitely. I think for me, one of the really powerful messages is when you get these kind of personal anecdotes that you include a lot in the book, and you've talked about on the podcast here. And it's great to have some science and some research behind that to give a little bit of empirical evidence to those anecdotes to really create a compelling narrative about race and how we can approach it better and hopefully fix some of the problems in the future. So, Dr. Eschmann, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your research with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was great. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I did work hard to try to make the book as accessible as possible.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Rob Eschmann, Associate Professor of Social Work at Columbia University and author of the book When the Hood Comes Off: Racism and Resistance in the Digital Age. You'll find a link to the book in the episode description. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. It is busy times in the academic calendar, so I'm not 100% sure when the next episode will drop, but keep an eye on your podcast feeds for when that will be. And until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melba. See you next time.